Imagine watching your child, the person you sacrificed everything for, look straight into a news camera and call you an abuser. That's exactly what happened to Grace Hartwell, and it was only the beginning of a nightmare that would test whether love could survive the ultimate betrayal. Before I continue with this story, tell us where you are watching from and subscribe to this channel for more wonderful stories. Grace Hartwell's hands trembled as she counted the bills for the third time, spreading them across her small kitchen table like a financial tarot reading that never revealed good news. Rent, utilities, groceries, car payment, the familiar dance of making ends meet that had choreographed her life for the past 15 years. At 49, she should have been planning for retirement, not calculating whether she could afford both gas and groceries this week. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the ancient refrigerator she'd been nursing along for 3 years. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a living room that doubled as her office when she brought work home from the insurance company. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, or had been, until Isabella moved in with her fiancé 6 months ago. Grace picked up the framed photo from the table's edge, careful not to disturb her budget calculations. Isabella at her college graduation, radiant in her cap and gown, Grace beaming beside her in the dress she'd worn to every important event for the past decade. The pride in that moment had been worth every double shift, every skipped meal, every date she'd turned down because Isabella needed her. Her phone buzzed. Isabella. Grace's heart did that automatic flutter it had done since her daughter was born, part joy, part anxiety, part overwhelming love that sometimes felt like drowning. "Hi, honey," Grace answered, already moving to clear the bills from the table. Old habit. She'd never wanted Isabella to worry about money the way she did. "Mom, we need to talk." Isabella's voice carried that edge it had developed lately, sharp, impatient, like Grace was an obstacle rather than the woman who'd raised her single-handedly after her father walked out. "Can you meet me at Bella Luna in an hour?" Grace glanced at her work clothes, already mentally calculating the cost of lunch at Isabella's favorite upscale restaurant. "Is everything okay, sweetheart? We'll discuss it when you get there. And Mom? Dress nice. This is important." The line went dead. Grace stared at her phone, that familiar knot forming in her stomach. Isabella had been different since the engagement, distant, demanding, speaking to her like she was a personal assistant rather than her mother. Grace had attributed it to wedding stress, but lately, she wondered if she was seeing glimpses of the woman her daughter was becoming. An hour later, Grace sat across from Isabella in a restaurant that smelled like fresh bread and expensive wine. She'd changed into her one good blouse and applied makeup to hide the exhaustion that had become her permanent expression. Isabella looked stunning as always, her dark hair perfectly styled, her engagement ring catching the light like a small star. She'd inherited her father's classical features but thankfully none of his character. "You look beautiful," Grace said, studying her daughter's face. Isabella did look beautiful, but there was something brittle about her smile, something calculated about the way she'd chosen this particular restaurant. "Thanks. You look..." Isabella paused, and Grace felt the familiar sting of not quite measuring up. "Nice." Isabella opened her purse and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been working on the wedding budget, and I need to know what you're contributing." Grace's stomach dropped. They'd talked about this before, vague conversations about helping where she could and making it special. But the folder suggested something far more concrete than Grace had prepared for. "Well, you know I want to help however I can, sweetheart. What were you thinking?" Isabella opened the folder, revealing what looked like a professional presentation. Colored charts, itemized lists, photographs of venues that looked like palaces. "The wedding is going to cost $150,000. The number hit Grace like a physical blow. $150,000. More than she'd made in the past 3 years combined. She thought of her savings account, the meager safety net she'd built through years of careful budgeting and constant worry. That's a lot of money, Isabella. It's what weddings cost now, Mom. Especially if you want them to be memorable." Isabella's voice carried that defensive tone Grace recognized from childhood, the one that meant she'd already made up her mind and was prepared to fight anyone who disagreed. "I'm sure we can find ways to make it beautiful without..." "Without what?" "Without embarrassing myself in front of Derek's family." Isabella's facade cracked slightly. "Do you know what his mother spent on her engagement party? $30,000. For a party. This is my wedding, Mom. The most important day of my life. Grace felt the familiar tug of guilt, the one that had driven every decision she'd made for the past 25 years. Isabella's happiness had been her North Star, her reason for everything. But $150,000. Sweetheart, I want your wedding to be perfect. But that's more money than Then you what? Than you have? Then you're willing to spend on your only daughter's happiness? Isabella's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby tables. Derek's parents are contributing $75,000. I need you to match that. $75,000. Grace's life savings, her emergency fund, her retirement, everything she'd worked for. She thought of all the times she'd said yes when she should have said no, all the times she'd given until it hurt because she thought that was what love meant. Isabella, I love you more than anything in this world. You know that. But I can't. Can't or won't. The question was sharp, precise. Because there's a difference. Grace looked into her daughter's eyes, eyes that had once looked at her like she hung the moon, and saw something that made her chest tighten. Expectation. Entitlement. The belief that Grace's love could be measured in dollars and cents. I won't, Grace said quietly. I won't empty my savings account for one day. I won't risk my financial security for a party. Isabella's face went very still. A party? That's what you think my wedding is? I think your wedding should be about marrying the man you love, not about impressing his family. Grace reached across the table, but Isabella pulled her hands away. Honey, I've given you everything I could for 25 years. I've worked myself to exhaustion to make sure you had opportunities one never had. But this? This what? This feels like you're trying to buy your way into a life that should accept you for who you are. The words hung between them like a verdict. Grace watched her daughter's face cycle through emotions, hurt, anger, disbelief, and finally, something that looked like betrayal. So that's it? After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? Everything you've done for me? Grace's voice was barely a whisper. Isabella, I think you have that backwards. Isabella stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I should have known better than to count on you. You've always been jealous of my success, my opportunities. You can't stand that I'm going to have the life you never could. The words hit Grace like slaps. That's not true. Your success is my greatest pride. Then prove it. Isabella's voice was cold, final. Write the check, or don't bother coming to the wedding. She walked away, leaving Grace alone with a folder full of dreams that cost more than her entire life savings. Grace sat in the expensive restaurant, surrounded by the sound of other people's conversations and the weight of her daughter's ultimatum, and wondered when loving someone had become so complicated. What do you think about Grace's decision? Should a mother sacrifice her financial security for her daughter's dream wedding, or was she right to set boundaries? Share your thoughts in the comments below. 3 weeks passed in suffocating silence. Grace had called Isabella 17 times, each call going straight to voicemail. She'd driven by Derek's upscale apartment twice, losing her nerve both times when she saw his BMW in the parking lot. The folder Isabella had left behind sat on Grace's kitchen table like evidence of her failure as a mother, its glossy pages mocking her with images of crystal chandeliers and imported flowers. Grace threw herself into work with desperate intensity, staying late at the insurance office to avoid going home to the quiet apartment that felt haunted by conversations that should have happened. Her coworkers noticed, Janet from claims had asked twice if she was feeling all right, and even Mr. Peterson, their perpetually distracted manager, had commented on her excessive overtime. Grace, you've been here every night this week, Janet said, appearing at her cubicle with 2 cups of coffee. What's going on? Grace looked up from the claim forms she'd been processing with mechanical precision. Janet's kind eyes held the sort of maternal concern that made Grace's throat tight. At 55, Janet had raised 3 children and buried a husband, emerging from each challenge with grace and wisdom. She was the closest thing Grace had to a mother figure, which felt absurd given their similar ages. Isabella and I had a disagreement, Grace said, accepting the coffee gratefully. About the wedding. Janet settled into the chair beside Grace's desk, her expression knowing. Money? How did you? Honey, I've been through 3 weddings with my girls. There's always a moment where they forget that love isn't measured in dollars. Janet sipped her coffee thoughtfully. What did she ask for? $75,000. The number still felt surreal coming out of her mouth. Janet's eyebrows rose. That's more than most people's annual salary. That's what I tried to tell her. Grace's voice cracked slightly. She said if I really loved her, I'd want her to be happy. And what did you say? I said I wouldn't empty my savings for one day. Grace stared at her hands. She hasn't spoken to me since. Janet was quiet for a moment, then reached over and squeezed Grace's shoulder. You did the right thing. Then why does it feel so wrong? Before Janet could answer, Grace's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Turn on Channel 7 News. Now. Grace's heart started racing. Something's wrong. She fumbled for the remote to the small TV in the break room, Janet following close behind. The local news was just coming back from commercial, and Grace's blood turned to ice when she saw the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen, Local Mother Accused of Elder Abuse. But it wasn't the headline that made her knees buckle. It was the photo filling the screen, her own face, taken from her LinkedIn profile, alongside the words, Grace Hartwell, 49, accused of financial manipulation and emotional abuse. What the hell, Janet started, but Grace shushed her as the anchor's voice filled the room. Contacted our newsroom this afternoon with disturbing allegations against her mother, Grace Hartwell of Millbrook. The daughter, who wishes to remain anonymous, claims that her mother has been systematically isolating her from family members and controlling her finances in what experts call a classic pattern of elder abuse. Grace's legs gave out. She sank into a chair, watching in horror as her life was dissected on live television. The story was masterfully constructed, just enough truth to be believable, just enough lies to be devastating. According to the daughter, Hartwell has been managing her finances since college, claiming it was for her own good, while simultaneously discouraging her from maintaining relationships with extended family members. The situation came to a head recently when the daughter attempted to plan her wedding, only to discover that her mother had been controlling access to her inheritance from her deceased father. That's not true, Grace whispered, but the words felt hollow in the face of the television's authority. The anchor continued. Child Protective Services has confirmed they are investigating the allegations. Hartwell works as a claims processor at Millbrook Insurance and has been employed there for over a decade. We reached out to her employer for comment, but they declined to respond. Grace's phone started ringing. The office phone joined it. Janet's face had gone pale, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to form words that wouldn't come. I need to go, Grace said, standing on shaking legs. Grace, wait. But she was already moving, grabbing her purse and coat, her mind reeling with the implications. Isabella had done this. Her own daughter had called the news station and painted her as an abuser. The inheritance from her father, there was no inheritance. Isabella's father had walked out with nothing but the clothes on his back and a gambling debt that had taken Grace years to pay off. The drive home passed in a blur of shock and disbelief. Grace's phone rang continuously, reporters, she assumed, hungry for her side of the story. She turned it off and drove in silence, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Her apartment building was surrounded by news vans. Grace parked 2 blocks away and walked, pulling her coat hood up against the February cold and the camera lenses that swung toward her like weapons. She managed to slip through the back entrance, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the key. Inside her apartment, she collapsed on her couch and stared at the ceiling. The silence was deafening. 25 years of sacrifice, of putting Isabella's needs above her own, of working double shifts and skipping meals and saying yes to everything because she thought that was what love meant. And this was her reward. Her landline rang. Grace considered ignoring it, but the caller ID showed Janet's number. Grace? Are you okay? I don't know. The words came out as a whisper. I don't understand how this happened. Peterson saw the news. He's putting you on administrative leave pending an investigation. Grace closed her eyes. Of course. Her job, her reputation, her entire life, Isabella had destroyed it all with a single phone call. There's something else, Janet said gently. The reporter called back. They want to do a follow-up story. They said they have documentation. What kind of documentation? Bank records, apparently. Showing large transfers from your account to hers over the years. They're calling it evidence of financial control. Grace almost laughed. Those transfers, college tuition, rent deposits, car payments, emergency funds when Isabella was between jobs. Every dollar given freely, lovingly, because that's what mothers did. But twisted through the lens of Isabella's narrative, they became evidence of manipulation. She's very smart, Grace said, surprising herself with how calm she sounded. She knew exactly what to say to make me look guilty. Grace, you need a lawyer. I can't afford a lawyer. I can't afford anything, remember? I'm supposedly this controlling monster who hoards money while my daughter suffers. There was a knock at her door. Grace's heart stopped. Ms. Hartwell? Channel 7 News. We'd like to get your side of the story. Grace hung up on Janet and turned off the lights. She sat in the dark, listening to the reporters outside her door, and wondered if Isabella was watching the news coverage. Was she satisfied with her handiwork? Did she feel any guilt as she watched her mother's life crumble? Her phone, which she'd turned back on to talk to Janet, buzzed with a text from Derek's number. You brought this on yourself. Just write the check and we'll make it go away. Grace stared at the message, and for the first time since watching the news, she felt something other than shock and hurt. She felt rage. White-hot, clarifying rage that burned through her confusion and showed her exactly what was happening. This wasn't about love or weddings or family. This was extortion. Isabella had weaponized the media, destroying her mother's reputation and livelihood to force her hand. And she'd been careful to do it in a way that would be nearly impossible to disprove. Grace typed back, "No." Her phone immediately rang. Derek. Mrs. Hartwell, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. Derek's voice was smooth, confident. Isabella is devastated by what she had to do, but you forced her hand. She just wants her mother at her wedding. She wants my money at her wedding, Grace corrected. There's a difference. Look, this doesn't have to get worse. Isabella can call the reporter back, clarify a few things. Maybe she was emotional, maybe she exaggerated. But she needs to know you're committed to her happiness. Grace felt something shift inside her, like a lock finally clicking open. You mean she needs to know I'm committed to funding her happiness? I mean she needs to know you love her enough to do what's right. I've spent 25 years doing what's right for Isabella. I've sacrificed my health, my relationships, my financial security. I've said yes to everything because I thought that was love. But this, Grace looked around her dark apartment, at the news van still visible through her window, at the wreckage of her life. This isn't love. This is manipulation. Mrs. Hartwell, tell my daughter that if she wants to destroy my life, she'll have to do it without my help. I won't be blackmailed into funding her fantasy. Grace hung up and turned off her phone. She sat in the dark, surrounded by the chaos Isabella had created, and for the first time in years, she felt something that might have been pride. Do you think Grace is making the right choice by refusing to give in to Isabella's manipulation? Is there ever a justification for a child to publicly humiliate their parent? Let us know what you think in the comments. The next morning brought a fresh wave of humiliation. Grace woke to find her apartment building surrounded by an even larger crowd of reporters, neighbors with cameras, and what appeared to be protesters holding signs that read, "Elder abuse is real" and "Justice for Isabella." Someone had leaked her address to social media, and the story had gone viral overnight. Grace made coffee with shaking hands, her kitchen blinds drawn tight against the chaos outside. Her phone, which she'd finally turned back on, showed 247 missed calls, 89 voicemails, and hundreds of text messages. Most were from reporters, but scattered among them were messages from people she hadn't heard from in years. Saw the news. Can't believe Isabella would do this to you. Mary, college roommate. Whatever happened, you don't deserve this public shaming. Tom, former coworker. The daughter sounds like a spoiled brat. Stay strong. Unknown number. But for every supportive message, there were 3 that made her stomach turn. Social media had appointed itself judge and jury, with strangers dissecting her life based on a 2-minute news segment. Financial abuse is serious. This mother needs to be held accountable. Anyone who would deny their child happiness over money is sick. Isabella is so brave for speaking out. Most abuse victims stay silent. Grace deleted the apps from her phone with trembling fingers. She couldn't stomach reading any more opinions about her life from people who'd never met her, never seen her work 3 jobs to keep Isabella in private school, never watched her cry herself to sleep after choosing between groceries and her daughter's field trip. A sharp knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Not the tentative tapping of reporters, this was authoritative, official. Grace opened the door to find a woman in a dark suit, flanked by a uniformed police officer. Her stomach dropped. "Grace Hartwell? I'm Detective Sarah Morrison with the Millbrook Police Department. This is Officer Chen. We need to ask you some questions about allegations of financial elder abuse." "Elder abuse?" Grace's voice came out as a croak. "I'm 49 years old. The allegations concern your control over your adult daughter's finances and emotional manipulation," Detective Morrison said, her tone professionally neutral. "May we come in?" Grace stepped aside, acutely aware of how her small apartment must look to these strangers: modest furniture, stack of bills on the kitchen table, the life of someone who counted every penny. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being accused of financial manipulation while living paycheck to paycheck. Detective Morrison settled onto Grace's worn couch and pulled out a notebook. "Your daughter Isabella contacted our department yesterday with concerns about financial abuse. She claims you've been controlling her access to her inheritance and using emotional manipulation to maintain power over her decisions." "What inheritance?" Grace asked. "Her father left when she was 8. He didn't leave us anything but debt. According to Miss Hartwell, there was a substantial inheritance from her paternal grandfather that you've been managing without her knowledge." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Isabella's paternal grandfather had died when she was 12, leaving behind a small life insurance policy that Grace had used to pay off the debts Isabella's father had accumulated. There had been maybe $8,000 after everything was settled, money Grace had spent on Isabella's dental work and summer camps. "There was a small life insurance policy," Grace said carefully. "I used it to pay off debts her father left behind and to cover some of Isabella's expenses. I have the documentation somewhere." Detective Morrison made a note. "We'll need to see those records. Your daughter also claims you've been systematically isolating her from family members." "What family members?" Grace's voice rose slightly. "It's been just the two of us since her father left. My parents died when she was young, and his family never wanted anything to do with us." But even as she said it, Grace felt a chill of recognition. There had been family members on her father's side, distant relatives who'd reached out occasionally over the years. Grace had been so focused on protecting Isabella from the chaos and disappointment that seemed to follow her father's family that she'd deflected those calls, made excuses about why they couldn't visit. She'd told herself she was protecting Isabella from people who might hurt her, but looking at it through Isabella's narrative. There were some relatives, Grace admitted, on her father's side. But they were complicated. Her father had issues with addiction and debt, and I was worried about exposing Isabella to that environment. Detective Morrison's pen moved across her notebook. "So you did prevent contact between your daughter and her extended family?" "I made decisions I thought were in her best interest." Grace's voice was getting smaller. Every choice she'd made with love and protection was being reframed as control and manipulation. "I was a single mother trying to keep my daughter safe." "Your daughter also mentioned that you've been managing her finances throughout her adult life. Bank accounts, credit cards, major purchases." Grace closed her eyes. When Isabella had turned 18, Grace had helped her open her first bank account. When she'd gone to college, Grace had co-signed for her credit cards and kept track of her spending to help her build good financial habits. When Isabella had graduated and struggled to find work, Grace had helped her with rent and car payments. All of it born from love. All of it looking suspicious under the harsh light of an investigation. "I helped her with financial planning," Grace said. "She asked for help. She was young and inexperienced with money. But you maintained access to her accounts? In case of emergencies. She knew I had the information. It wasn't a secret." Detective Morrison looked up from her notes. "Mrs. Hartwell, I need to ask, have you been transferring money from your daughter's accounts to your own?" "What? No." Grace's voice was sharp with shock. "I've never taken money from Isabella. If anything, I've given her thousands of dollars over the years. We have records of significant transfers from accounts with your daughter's name to accounts with yours." Grace's mind raced. The only transfers she could think of were the times Isabella had paid her back for expenses, the car payment Grace had covered when Isabella was between jobs, the security deposit for Isabella's apartment that Grace had fronted. But those payments had been sporadic and often partial. Isabella had always been casual about money, promising to pay her mother back when things settled down. Those were loan repayments, Grace said. Partial repayments. I have records of what she owed me. Detective Morrison made another note. We'll need to see those records as well. The questions continued for another hour. Each one made Grace feel smaller, guiltier, like she was drowning in a narrative that twisted every act of love into evidence of manipulation. By the time the detective left, Grace felt hollowed out, uncertain of her own memories. Her phone rang immediately after the door closed. Janet. Grace, thank God. Are you okay? I saw the police cars outside your building on the news. They think I'm a financial abuser, Grace said, slumping onto her couch. They have bank records showing money transfers that make it look like I was stealing from Isabella. That's ridiculous. You've given that girl everything. But I also had access to her accounts. I helped her manage her money. I made decisions about family relationships. Grace's voice cracked. Janet, what if I did manipulate her? What if I was so afraid of losing her that I controlled her without realizing it? Grace Hartwell, you stop that right now. I've watched you sacrifice your entire life for that girl. You worked yourself to exhaustion to give her opportunities. You turned down dates, promotions, chances at happiness because you thought she needed you. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe I needed her to need me. Janet was quiet for a moment. Maybe you did. But that doesn't make you an abuser. That makes you a mother who was doing her best alone. Grace stared at the ceiling, tears sliding down her cheeks. She's going to destroy me, Janet. My job, my reputation, my home, she's taking everything. Then you need to fight back. How? Every choice I made out of love can be twisted into evidence against me. She's painted herself as the victim and me as the monster. Who's going to believe a mother over her tearful daughter? People who know you. People who've seen you work 3 jobs to pay for her college. People who remember you missing your own meals to make sure she had lunch money. Grace's phone buzzed with another text from Derek's number. The story is getting bigger. Local news wants to do a special segment. You can still stop this. Grace showed the message to Janet through the phone's camera. He's threatening you, Janet said, her voice hard. They're threatening to make this worse if you don't pay. I know. So what are you going to do? Grace looked around her small apartment, the home she'd worked so hard to maintain, now invaded by police and reporters. She thought about Isabella, probably watching the news coverage with Derek, seeing how effectively she destroyed her mother's life with a single phone call. I'm going to let her finish what she started, Grace said quietly. What do you mean? I mean I'm not going to fight back. I'm not going to defend myself or explain my choices or try to prove that I loved her. If Isabella wants to destroy me to get what she wants, then she'll have to live with what that makes her. Grace. No, Janet. I've spent 25 years trying to prove my love to her. I've sacrificed everything to make her happy. And it was never enough. It will never be enough. So let her have her wedding fund. Let her have her victim narrative. Let her have whatever she thinks she needs. Grace hung up and turned off her phone. Outside, the crowd of reporters and onlookers continued their vigil, waiting for her to emerge, to break down, to give them the dramatic conclusion their story demanded. But Grace had nothing left to give. She'd given everything to Isabella already, and her daughter had used it as ammunition against her. The well of maternal sacrifice had finally run dry. For the first time in 25 years, Grace was done trying to prove her love. If Isabella wanted to destroy her mother to fund her fairy tale wedding, she would have to do it without Grace's participation. Is Grace giving up too easily, or is there wisdom in refusing to engage with manipulation? What would you do if your own child turned against you so publicly? Share your thoughts below. 5 days after the police interview, Grace was summoned to court. Not for criminal charges. The district attorney had apparently decided there wasn't enough evidence for financial abuse, but for a civil restraining order hearing. Isabella was requesting legal protection from her financially abusive and emotionally manipulative mother. Grace sat in the courthouse waiting room, wearing her one good blazer and clutching a folder of financial records that Janet had helped her organize. Her court-appointed attorney, a harried public defender named Robert Kim, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The good news is that civil restraining orders are hard to get without evidence of physical threat, he said, flipping through his notes. The bad news is that your daughter has created a compelling narrative, and family court judges err on the side of caution. Grace nodded, though she barely heard him. She was staring across the waiting room at Isabella, who sat with Derek and a lawyer in an expensive suit. Her daughter looked pale but determined, her hands folded in her lap like she was attending church rather than attempting to legally banish her mother from her life. Their eyes met for a moment, the first time they'd seen each other since that devastating lunch at Bella Luna. Grace expected anger or defiance in Isabella's gaze, but what she saw was worse, complete certainty. Isabella looked at her mother like she was looking at a stranger, someone to be managed rather than loved. Grace Hartwell versus Isabella Hartwell Manning, the bailiff called. Grace's legs felt unsteady as she followed her lawyer into the courtroom. The judge, an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair, looked between the two women with obvious sadness. Family court was probably full of moments like this, love turned toxic, relationships shattered by misunderstanding and pain. Isabella's lawyer stood first, painting a picture of systematic financial control and emotional manipulation that made Grace sound like a monster. He presented bank records showing Grace's access to Isabella's accounts, documentation of the limited contact with extended family, and Isabella's own tearful testimony about feeling trapped and controlled. Your Honor, my client has been systematically isolated from family members and had her financial autonomy stripped away by someone who was supposed to protect her, the lawyer said. She's requesting this restraining order not out of spite, but out of necessity. She needs legal protection to begin healing from years of psychological manipulation. When it was Grace's turn to respond, she felt like she was speaking underwater. Her lawyer presented their evidence, receipts showing money flowing from Grace to Isabella, not the other way around, documentation of Isabella's debts that Grace had paid, records of the genuine care and sacrifice. But it all sounded hollow in the face of Isabella's composed testimony. When the judge asked Isabella to speak, she stood with perfect posture and spoke in a voice that trembled just enough to convey vulnerability without appearing weak. Your Honor, I know this is hard to understand. My mother isn't a monster. She genuinely believes she was helping me. But she made every major decision in my life. Where I lived, who I could see, how I spent my money. When I tried to plan my wedding, the most important day of my life, she tried to sabotage it by refusing to honor her financial commitments. Grace wanted to scream. What financial commitments? When had she ever promised to pay for Isabella's wedding? But Isabella continued, her voice gaining strength. I know the bank records show money going from her accounts to mine, but those were gifts she used to maintain control. She'd give me money, then use my gratitude as leverage to make decisions for me. When I finally tried to assert my independence, she cut me off completely and tried to turn my fiancé's family against me. It was masterfully done. Isabella was reframing Grace's generosity as manipulation, her concern as control, her boundaries as abuse. And because it contained just enough truth, Grace had made decisions for Isabella, had influenced her choices, had worried about her relationships, it was nearly impossible to disprove. When the judge asked Grace to respond, she stood on shaking legs. Your Honor, I love my daughter more than my own life. Every decision I made was because I was trying to protect her or help her. Yes, I helped manage her finances, but only because she asked me to. Yes, I limited contact with some family members, but they had histories of addiction and instability that I didn't want affecting her. Grace's voice grew stronger as she continued. I worked 3 jobs to pay for her college. I went without so she could have dance lessons and summer camps and opportunities one never had. I gave her everything I could, and when she asked me to empty my life savings for one day, a wedding that costs more than most people make in years, I said no. Not because I don't love her, but because I do. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Grace could see tears in the judge's eyes, but she could also see the uncertainty there. Without knowing the full history, how could anyone determine where legitimate concern ended and control began? I'm going to order a brief recess, the judge said. I'd like to speak with both parties separately. During the recess, Grace found herself alone with Isabella in the courthouse bathroom. Her daughter was touching up her lipstick in the mirror, her hand steady as if she wasn't in the process of legally disowning her mother. Isabella, Grace said quietly. Please. We don't have to do this. Isabella's eyes met hers in the mirror. You did this, Mom. All you had to do was write the check. Is that really what this is about? Money? It's about respect. Isabella turned to face her mother directly. It's about you finally treating me like an adult instead of a child you need to manage. By demanding I empty my savings account? By supporting my choices even when you disagree with them. Isabella's voice was cold, controlled. Derek's family thinks I come from nothing because my mother drives a 10-year-old car and lives in a studio apartment. Do you know how humiliating that is? Grace felt like she'd been slapped. I'm sorry my life isn't impressive enough for your new family. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? Grace stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. You're ashamed of me, Isabella. You're ashamed of where you come from, ashamed of the woman who sacrificed everything to give you a better life. And now you're destroying me to erase the evidence of your humble beginnings. Isabella's composure cracked slightly. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Then help me understand. Talk to me instead of setting up elaborate schemes to destroy my life. For a moment, Grace saw something vulnerable in her daughter's eyes, fear, maybe, or uncertainty. But before Isabella could respond, Derek appeared in the doorway. Isabella, we need to get back. Your lawyer wants to prep you for the judge's questions. The moment was broken. Isabella straightened her shoulders and walked past Grace without another word. But Grace had seen the crack in her armor, the brief glimpse of the scared young woman beneath the calculated manipulator. When court resumed, the judge announced her decision. I'm not granting the restraining order. While I understand that family relationships can be complex and sometimes unhealthy, I don't see evidence of behavior that rises to the level requiring legal intervention. Grace felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. However, the judge continued, I'm strongly recommending that both parties engage in family counseling. There are clearly deep issues here that need to be addressed in a therapeutic setting rather than a courtroom. Isabella's lawyer immediately stood. Your Honor, my client doesn't feel safe engaging in counseling with her abuser. Then I recommend individual counseling for both parties, with the possibility of joint sessions if and when both feel ready. The judge looked directly at Grace and Isabella. Your mother and daughter. Whatever has happened between you, that bond is sacred. Don't let pride or hurt destroy something that could still be healed. As they filed out of the courtroom, Grace felt hollowed out but strangely hopeful. The judge hadn't bought Isabella's narrative completely. There was still a chance for truth, for healing, for some kind of reconciliation. But as she watched Isabella walk away with Derek and her lawyer, Grace wondered if her daughter wanted healing, or if she just wanted to win. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. Grace pulled her coat hood up and tried to push through the crowd, but a microphone was shoved in her face. Ms. Hartwell, how do you respond to your daughter's allegations? Grace stopped walking. For days, she'd hidden from the cameras, refused to engage with the media circus Isabella had created. But something about the judge's words, about the sacred bond between mother and daughter, made her turn and face the reporters. I love my daughter, she said simply. I've loved her every day of her life, and I'll love her every day until I die. That's all I have to say. She walked away, leaving the reporters scrambling for a more dramatic quote. But Grace was done performing for other people's entertainment. If Isabella wanted to destroy her, she'd have to do it without Grace's participation. Behind her, she could hear Derek's voice giving a statement about Isabella's courage and their plans to move forward with the wedding. Grace didn't turn around. She'd said everything that mattered. She loved her daughter. Everything else was just noise. 2 weeks after the court hearing, Grace received an unexpected visitor. She was sorting through boxes in her bedroom, trying to organize the financial records her lawyer had requested, when her doorbell rang. The reporters had finally moved on to other stories, so Grace opened the door without checking the peephole. An elderly woman stood in the hallway, her silver hair neatly styled and her clothes expensive but understated. She looked familiar in a way that made Grace's chest tighten with recognition she couldn't quite place. Grace? I'm Margaret Caldwell. Isabella's great-aunt. Her father's aunt. The woman's voice was gentle but determined. I think we need to talk. Grace's hand tightened on the door frame. Margaret, she remembered now. Isabella's father had mentioned her occasionally, the aunt who'd raised him after his parents died. Grace had spoken to her on the phone a few times over the years, brief conversations that Isabella's father had always cut short. I saw the news, Margaret continued. About the court case, about Isabella's allegations. I couldn't stay silent anymore. Grace stepped aside to let her in, her mind racing. This was one of the family members she'd limited Isabella's contact with, one of the relationships she'd controlled according to her daughter's narrative. But looking at Margaret now, dignified, concerned, clearly not the toxic influence Grace had imagined, she felt the first stirrings of doubt about her own choices. Margaret settled onto Grace's couch and pulled out a worn leather photo album. I've been wanting to reach out for years, but I respected your wishes about maintaining distance. After Michael left you and Isabella, you made it clear that his family wasn't welcome in your lives. Grace's memory sharpened painfully. She remembered those phone calls in the early years after Michael's abandonment, Margaret trying to maintain contact with Isabella, offering help, wanting to be part of her grandniece's life. Grace had been polite but firm, they were fine on their own, they didn't need anything from Michael's family, it was better for Isabella to have a clean break from that chaos. I thought I was protecting her, Grace said quietly. Michael left us with so much debt, so much pain. I didn't want Isabella exposed to anything that might remind her of him. Margaret opened the photo album, revealing pages of pictures Grace had never seen. Isabella as a baby in Margaret's arms. Michael as a young man, before addiction had hollowed him out. A family that looked happy and normal, not the toxic wasteland Grace had imagined. Michael was troubled, yes. But he wasn't the only one in our family. Isabella has cousins, uncles, grandparents who would have loved to know her. Margaret's voice was sad but not accusatory. We respected your decision, but it was hard. She was our only connection to Michael after he disappeared. Grace stared at the photos, feeling sick. I didn't know. He made his family sound like they were all addicts and criminals. Michael had a gift for rewriting history to make himself look better. Margaret turned a page, revealing more photos, family gatherings, holidays, normal people living normal lives. After he left you, we tried to find him. We wanted to help, maybe get him into treatment. But he'd vanished completely. Grace's throat felt tight. Isabella thinks there was an inheritance. From her grandfather. Margaret's expression grew pained. There was. Not much, about $40,000 from her great-grandfather's life insurance policy. I've been holding it in trust for her since she turned 18. The room seemed to tilt. Grace gripped the arm of her chair, the implications crashing over her. $40,000? I sent letters to your address when she turned 18, then again when she turned 21. I never heard back. I assumed. Margaret's voice trailed off as she saw Grace's expression. You never got the letters. Grace's mind raced back through the years, remembering how she'd screened Isabella's mail to protect her from her father's creditors who might still be looking for payment. She'd thrown away anything that looked like it might be connected to Michael's family or his debts. She'd probably thrown away Margaret's letters without opening them. Oh God, Grace whispered. I threw them away. I thought they were from debt collectors or... I was trying to protect her from Michael's mess. Margaret reached across and squeezed Grace's hand. You were doing what you thought was best. But Grace, Isabella has been trying to contact me for the past 2 years. She found my address online and started writing to me. Grace's blood ran cold. What? She's been asking about her father, about our family, about any inheritance she might be entitled to. I explained about the trust fund, told her she could access it whenever she was ready. Margaret's voice grew troubled. But she also asked me not to tell you about our correspondence. She said you got upset whenever Michael's family was mentioned. The pieces were falling into place like shards of glass, each one cutting deeper than the last. Isabella had known about the inheritance. She'd been in contact with her father's family for years. And she'd used Grace's protective instincts, the same instincts that had led her to cut off contact with Margaret in the first place, to maintain the deception. The wedding, Grace said, her voice barely audible. She has the money for the wedding. Margaret nodded sadly. 40,000, plus the interest it's earned over the years. It's not enough for the kind of wedding she described to me, but it's substantial. Grace felt like she was drowning. Every assumption she'd made, every choice she'd defended, every sacrifice she'd rationalized, all of it was built on lies. Isabella had painted her as a controlling mother who cut her off from family, but Grace had made those decisions to protect a daughter who was secretly maintaining the very relationships Grace thought she was preventing. "Why?" Grace asked. "Why would she do this to me?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying the photos in her album. "I think Isabella is very angry, Grace. About her father leaving, about growing up without family, about feeling like she never had the life other children had. And sometimes when we're angry about things we can't change, we lash out at the people who stayed. I gave her everything I could. I know you did. But children don't always see sacrifice as love. Sometimes they see it as proof that love requires suffering." Margaret closed the album gently. "Isabella told me about the wedding demands, about you refusing to pay. She asked if I thought she was being unreasonable." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that love isn't measured in dollars, and that destroying someone to get what you want isn't love at all." Margaret's voice was firm. "I also told her that if she wanted a relationship with our family, it wouldn't be built on lies and manipulation." Grace stared at her hands, trying to process the magnitude of Isabella's deception. Her daughter had spent years building relationships that Grace thought she'd prevented, accessing money that Grace didn't know existed, and planning a public destruction based on half-truths and manipulated narratives. "She played me," Grace said finally. "She knew exactly how to make me look like the villain in her story." "She's hurting, Grace. Hurt people often hurt the people closest to them because they're the safest targets." Margaret leaned forward. "But that doesn't excuse what she's done to you. She's let her pain justify cruelty." Grace's phone rang. Isabella's number. Grace stared at it, her heart pounding. "Answer it," Margaret said gently. "It's time for truth." Grace accepted the call, putting it on speaker. Isabella's voice filled the room, tight with something that might have been panic. "Mom? I need to see you. Something's happened." "What's wrong?" "Derek? Derek found out about Aunt Margaret. About the money. He's calling off the wedding. He says I lied to him about our financial situation." Isabella's voice cracked. "He says if I can manipulate you, I'll manipulate him." Grace looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "Where are you, Isabella?" "I'm at Derek's apartment. But he asked me to leave. I don't have anywhere else to go." The words hung in the air like a confession. After everything, the public humiliation, the court case, the systematic destruction of Grace's reputation, Isabella was calling her mother because she had nowhere else to turn. Grace closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 25 years of complicated love pressing down on her chest. "Come home, sweetheart. We need to talk." Isabella arrived at Grace's apartment looking like a broken version of herself. Her perfect makeup was smudged with tears, her designer clothes wrinkled, and she carried a single overnight bag like a refugee from her own life. When Grace opened the door, Isabella hesitated on the threshold, uncertainty flickering across her face. "I didn't know where else to go," Isabella said, her voice small and hoarse. Grace stepped aside without a word, watching her daughter enter the modest apartment she'd once been too ashamed to let Derek see. Margaret had left an hour earlier, but not before making Grace promise to call if she needed support. Isabella set her bag down by the door and stood in the living room like a stranger, her eyes taking in details she'd probably never noticed before, the framed photos of her throughout the years, the worn furniture Grace had kept pristine through careful maintenance, the small touches that made the space a home despite its limitations. "You kept all of these," Isabella said, stopping in front of a wall of photographs. Pictures from every stage of her life, first steps, dance recitals, graduation day, candid moments of laughter and love that spanned 25 years. "Of course I did." Grace's voice was careful, neutral. "You're my daughter." Isabella's shoulders shook slightly. "Even after everything I did to you?" Grace moved to the kitchen, needing something to do with her hands. "Are you hungry? I could make some tea." It was such a normal, maternal offer that Isabella almost smiled. "Tea sounds good." Grace busied herself with the familiar ritual, filling the kettle, selecting mugs, arranging cookies on a plate she saved for special occasions. Isabella watched from the living room, and Grace could feel the weight of unspoken words building between them. "Margaret came to see me," Grace said as she waited for the water to boil. "She told me about the letters. About the inheritance. About your correspondence with her." Isabella's face crumpled. I know. She called Derek after you two talked. She told him everything, about the money, about how I'd been lying about our family situation. Isabella sank onto the couch. He said he couldn't marry someone who would destroy their own mother for money they already had access to. The kettle whistled, and Grace poured the hot water over tea bags, her movements mechanical. How long have you been in contact with her? 2 years. Isabella's voice was barely audible. I found her address online after you mentioned her name once. I was curious about Dad's family, about whether there was anyone left who might remember him. Grace carried the tea tray to the living room and sat across from her daughter, maintaining careful distance. Why didn't you tell me? Isabella accepted the mug with shaking hands. Because I knew you'd try to stop me. You always got upset when I asked about Dad or his family. I thought you didn't want me to know them because you were ashamed of him. I was trying to protect you from his chaos. Your father left us with $60,000 in debt from his gambling. It took me 5 years to pay it off. Grace's voice was steady, factual. I didn't want you exposed to anything that might bring that instability back into our lives. But you never told me that. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. You just said he was troubled and that we were better off without his family. I grew up thinking there was something wrong with our entire bloodline. Grace felt a stab of recognition. She'd been so focused on protecting Isabella from painful details that she'd created an information vacuum that Isabella had filled with her own fears and assumptions. You're right, Grace said quietly. I should have been more honest with you about why I made those choices. They sat in silence for a moment, sipping tea and navigating the unfamiliar territory of honesty. Isabella pulled a throw pillow into her lap, hugging it like armor. Margaret told me about the debt, Isabella said finally. About how you spent years paying off Dad's mistakes. I never knew. I didn't want you to carry that burden. You were a child. But I wasn't a child when I turned 18. Or 21. Or 25. Isabella's voice grew stronger. You kept making decisions for me like I was still 8 years old. Grace considered this, recognizing the truth in it. You're right about that too. I got so used to protecting you that I forgot you might not need protecting anymore. I felt suffocated, Isabella continued, the words tumbling out like she'd been holding them back for years. Every time I made a decision, you had an opinion. Every time I dated someone, you found something wrong with them. Every time I wanted to spend money or take a trip or make a choice you disagreed with, I felt like I was disappointing you. Grace's chest tightened. I was worried about you. I wanted you to have better opportunities than I did. But you never asked what I wanted. You decided what was best for me and then got hurt when I didn't appreciate it. Isabella set down her mug and looked directly at Grace. Do you know how guilty that made me feel? How trapped? The words hit Grace like physical blows. She thought of all the times she'd made suggestions about Isabella's life, all the ways she'd tried to guide and protect and improve her daughter's choices. She'd thought she was being loving. Isabella had experienced it as control. I'm sorry, Grace said, and meant it. I never intended to make you feel trapped. I know you didn't. That's what made it so hard. Isabella's voice cracked. I knew you loved me. I knew everything you did came from love. But it felt like your love came with conditions, that I had to make the choices you wanted me to make to earn it. Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks. My love never had conditions, Isabella. Never. But the money did. Your support did. Every time I wanted something you disapproved of, you found a way to talk me out of it. Isabella wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. When you refused to pay for the wedding, it felt like you were refusing to support my happiness because you didn't like my choices. The wedding wasn't about your happiness. It was about impressing Derek's family. Maybe it was both. Isabella's voice was small. Maybe I wanted to feel like I belonged somewhere, and I thought if the wedding was beautiful enough, expensive enough, his family would accept me. Grace leaned forward, studying her daughter's face. Did they make you feel like you weren't good enough? Isabella nodded miserably. Derek's mother kept making comments about different backgrounds and adjusting expectations. She never said anything directly mean, but I could tell she thought Derek was settling for me. Grace felt a surge of protective anger. That woman has no right to judge you. But she did judge me. And I was so desperate to prove her wrong that I convinced myself the perfect wedding would fix everything. Isabella laughed bitterly. I destroyed our relationship for a man whose mother thinks I'm beneath her social class. You didn't destroy our relationship, Grace said firmly. You damaged it. But relationships can heal if both people want them to. Isabella looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. Do you want that? After everything I did to you? Grace was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the news cameras, the court hearing, the public humiliation, the weeks of isolation and shame. Then she looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the manipulator who'd orchestrated her downfall, but the scared young woman who'd felt trapped and desperate enough to lash out at the person who loved her most. You're my daughter, Grace said simply. I don't know how to stop loving you, even when you hurt me. Isabella broke down completely then, 25 years of complicated emotions pouring out in devastating sobs. Grace hesitated for only a moment before moving to the couch and pulling her daughter into her arms. Isabella clung to her like she was drowning, and Grace held her like she had when Isabella was small and the world felt too big and scary. I'm sorry, Isabella whispered against Grace's shoulder. I'm so sorry, Mom. I was angry and hurt and I wanted you to feel as trapped as I felt. But I never wanted to destroy you. I know, sweetheart. I know. They held each other on Grace's worn couch, surrounded by photos of happier times, and began the slow work of rebuilding trust. It wouldn't be easy, there were still hurt feelings to process, boundaries to establish, patterns to break. But for the first time in months, Grace felt hope blooming in her chest. Her daughter was home. Broken and sorry and finally ready to have the honest conversations they should have been having for years. It was a beginning. We have a lot to figure out, Grace said softly, stroking Isabella's hair. I know. But maybe we can figure it out together this time? Isabella pulled back to look at her mother's face. No more secrets. No more manipulation. Just honest conversations about what we both need. Grace smiled through her tears. I'd like that. Outside, the world continued spinning, full of people who thought they knew the story of Grace and Isabella Hartwell based on a 2-minute news segment. But inside Grace's small apartment, mother and daughter were writing a different story, one of forgiveness, growth, and the possibility that love could survive even its own worst impulses. For 3 days, Grace and Isabella existed in a fragile bubble of tentative healing. Isabella slept in her childhood bed. Grace had never converted her room, keeping it exactly as it was when Isabella moved out, and they fell into careful routines. Coffee in the morning, quiet conversations, shared meals that felt like peace offerings. Grace had taken indefinite leave from work while the company reviewed her situation, so they had time to talk in ways they hadn't in years. Isabella helped with household tasks, seeming to notice for the first time how carefully Grace managed every dollar, every decision. They were learning to see each other as adults rather than the roles they'd been locked into for so long. On Thursday morning, Grace was making breakfast when Isabella's phone rang. Derek's ringtone, the song that had once made Isabella's face light up, now made her tense with anxiety. I should answer it, Isabella said, though she made no move toward the phone. Do you want to? Grace asked, flipping pancakes with studied casualness. Isabella stared at the phone until it stopped ringing. I don't know. Part of me hopes he'll say he made a mistake, that he wants to work things out. But part of me wonders if I ever really loved him or if I just loved the idea of his life. Before Grace could respond, the phone rang again. This time it was an unknown number. Isabella answered cautiously. Hello? Grace watched her daughter's face change, confusion giving way to alarm, then to something that looked like panic. What? No, that's not. Who is this? Isabella put the call on speaker, her hands shaking. A woman's voice filled the kitchen, crisp and professional. This is Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. I'm calling to get your response to Derek Manning's allegations about your family's financial situation. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Hang up, she whispered, but Isabella seemed frozen. I'm sorry, I don't understand, Isabella said into the phone. Mr. Manning contacted our newsroom yesterday with additional information about your mother's alleged financial abuse. He's provided documentation suggesting that you've had access to significant family funds throughout this entire ordeal, and that your mother was actually protecting your inheritance rather than controlling it. The pancakes began to burn. Grace turned off the stove with numb fingers, watching her daughter's world collapse in real time. He's also provided recordings of conversations where you allegedly discussed strategies for pressuring your mother into paying for your wedding, including the decision to contact our newsroom with abuse allegations." Isabella's face went white. "He recorded our conversations?" "Mr. Manning says he became concerned about your behavior patterns and began documenting your conversations for his own protection. Are you willing to comment on these allegations?" Isabella hung up, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the phone. "He recorded me. He recorded our private conversations and gave them to the news." Grace felt sick. "What conversations?" Isabella's phone rang again. Another unknown number. Then another. The news had gotten hold of a new angle to their story, and the feeding frenzy was beginning again. "Isabella, what conversations?" Grace's voice was sharper now, fear making her impatient. Isabella turned off her phone and sat heavily at the kitchen table. "We talked about strategies for getting you to pay for the wedding. Derek thought if we could prove you were being unreasonable, maybe his parents would increase their contribution." Grace sat across from her daughter, her heart starting to pound. "What kind of strategies?" "Just ways to show them how you were being unfair. Derek said his mother would be more sympathetic if she understood how controlling you were being." Isabella's words came out in a rush. "It was his idea to document everything, to record our conversations about your behavior so we could show his family that I wasn't just being spoiled." "You recorded conversations about me?" Grace's voice was very quiet. "Not about you specifically. About the situation. About how frustrated I was." Isabella looked up, desperation in her eyes. "Mom, you have to understand, I was just venting. I was hurt and angry and Derek was the only one who seemed to understand how trapped I felt." Grace's chest felt tight. "What did you say about me in these recordings?" Isabella's silence was answer enough. "Isabella, what did you say?" I said you were controlling. That you used money to manipulate me. That you'd isolated me from family and made all my decisions for me." The words came out like a confession. "But I was angry when I said those things. I didn't mean for anyone else to hear them." Grace felt the careful peace they'd built over the past 3 days crumbling like sand. "You were building a case against me." "No. I was just trying to get Derek to understand why I was so upset. By painting me as an abuser. By explaining why I felt suffocated." Isabella's voice rose. "Mom, you have to understand, I felt trapped. I felt like I couldn't make any choices without your approval. When you refused to pay for the wedding, it felt like you were rejecting my entire future." Grace stood up, pacing to the window. Outside, she could see news vans pulling up to the building again. Round 2 of her public humiliation was about to begin. "So you and Derek planned my destruction together." "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" Grace turned to face her daughter, and Isabella flinched at the coldness in her voice. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you and your fiancé systematically documented everything I did wrong so you could use it against me when I didn't give you what you wanted. Derek said his family needed to understand our situation. Derek was gathering ammunition." Grace's voice was deadly calm. "And you helped him load the gun." Isabella's phone, which she'd turned back on, started buzzing with notifications. Text messages, missed calls, social media alerts. The story was exploding again, but this time Isabella was the villain. "Oh God," Isabella whispered, reading the messages. "They're saying I'm a manipulative liar. They're saying I destroyed my own mother for money I already had." Grace felt a bitter laugh rising in her throat. "How does it feel? Being judged by strangers who don't know the whole story." "Mom, please." "No, Isabella. I want to know. How does it feel to have your private pain turned into public entertainment? How does it feel to have people you've never met decide whether you're worthy of love based on a news report?" Isabella was crying now, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never wanted it to go this far. But you did want to hurt me." Grace's voice was flat, emotionless. "You wanted me to feel small and powerless and wrong. You wanted me to question every choice I'd made as your mother. You wanted me to suffer. I wanted you to understand how I felt. By destroying my reputation? By accusing me of elder abuse? By turning my love for you into evidence of my guilt?" Grace's composure finally cracked. "You didn't want understanding, Isabella. You wanted revenge. The words hung between them like a death sentence. Isabella looked at her mother with devastation in her eyes, finally seeing the full scope of what she'd done. "I was angry," she whispered. "So was I," Grace said. "I was angry that my daughter thought so little of my sacrifices that she'd try to manipulate me into funding her fantasy. But I didn't try to destroy your life over it." Grace's phone rang. Margaret's number. "Margaret saw the news," Grace said after answering. "She's coming over." "Mom, please don't let her." "Don't let her what? Tell the truth? Support me the way you should have." Grace's voice was getting louder. "You want to know what's really ironic, Isabella? You accused me of isolating you from family, but Margaret has been trying to reach out to you for years. I was the one who limited that contact, trying to protect you from complications I thought you couldn't handle. But you knew about her all along. You've been talking to her, building a relationship with her, accessing money I didn't even know existed." Isabella wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "I wanted to tell you." "When? When were you planning to tell me? After you'd used my protective instincts to make me look like a controlling monster? After you'd convinced everyone that I was a financial abuser who kept you from your inheritance?" The full magnitude of Isabella's deception was becoming clear. She'd used Grace's own love against her, twisted her protective choices into evidence of abuse, and manipulated every relationship and situation to support her narrative. "You played me," Grace said, her voice breaking. "You played me like a fiddle, and I never saw it coming because I loved you too much to believe you could be that calculating." "I'm not calculating." Isabella stood up, desperation making her voice shrill. I'm just a mess, okay? I'm 25 years old and I don't know who I am or what I want or how to be a person without you making all my decisions for me. So you decided to destroy me instead of having an honest conversation. I tried to have honest conversations. Every time I tried to tell you how I felt, you'd explain why I was wrong or why you knew better or why I should be grateful instead of complaining. Grace opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. There was truth in what Isabella was saying, painful, complicated truth about how Grace's protective love had sometimes felt like dismissal, how her experience had sometimes overshadowed Isabella's autonomy. But there was also truth in Grace's anger. Whatever communication problems they'd had, whatever mistakes Grace had made, Isabella had chosen the nuclear option. She'd chosen public humiliation over private healing, manipulation over honest confrontation. "You're right," Grace said quietly. "I probably did dismiss your feelings sometimes. I probably did make decisions for you that I should have let you make yourself. But Isabella, what you did to me, that wasn't about communication. That was about control. You wanted to control the narrative, control the outcome, control me." Isabella sank back into her chair, the fight going out of her. I know it was wrong. I felt so powerless, and making you powerless felt like the only way to balance the scales." The honesty was devastating and too late. Grace looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw not just the woman she'd raised, but the woman Isabella had chosen to become. Someone who would weaponize love when she didn't get her way. Someone who would destroy the people closest to her to avoid feeling vulnerable. "I need you to leave," Grace said. "Mom, I need you to leave. I can't look at you right now without seeing what you did to me. What you're still doing to me." Grace's voice was steady but empty. "Maybe someday I'll be able to forgive this. But not today. Not while the cameras are outside and my life is falling apart and you're sitting in my kitchen explaining why you had the right to destroy me." Isabella stood slowly, her face crumpling. "Where am I supposed to go? You have $40,000 in inheritance and a family who wants to know you. You'll figure it out." Grace turned away, unable to watch her daughter gather her things. "You're good at figuring out how to get what you want." The words were cruel and accurate. Isabella left without another word, and Grace was alone again in her small apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of their relationship and the sound of reporters gathering outside. This time, she didn't think love would be enough to fix what had been broken. Grace spent the next 4 days in complete isolation. She unplugged her landline, turned off her phone, and closed her blinds against the world. The reporters had multiplied outside her building like a virus, feeding off the new scandal of Derek's recordings and Isabella's exposed manipulations. But inside her apartment, Grace existed in a bubble of profound silence. She didn't eat much. Sleep came in fragments. Mostly, she sat on her couch staring at the wall of photographs, 25 years of smiles and milestones that now felt like evidence in a case she couldn't win. Every picture told the story of a mother who'd loved too much and a daughter who'd used that love as a weapon. On the 5th day, Margaret arrived with groceries and determination. "You can't hide forever," she said, setting bags on Grace's kitchen counter. "I've been calling for days." Grace emerged from her bedroom in rumpled pajamas, looking like a ghost of herself. "I'm not hiding. I'm processing. You're disappearing." Margaret began unpacking food, real food, not the crackers and peanut butter Grace had been surviving on. "And while you're disappearing, Isabella is falling apart." Grace felt a familiar tug in her chest and fought against it. "That's not my problem anymore. She's been staying with me since she left here. She hasn't eaten, hasn't slept, hasn't stopped crying." Margaret's voice was gentle but insistent. "She knows what she did was unforgivable. She's not asking for forgiveness. She's just breaking." Grace sat heavily at her kitchen table. "Good. Maybe now she knows how I felt." Margaret studied Grace's face with concern. "Is that really what you want? For your daughter to suffer the way you suffered?" "I want her to understand that actions have consequences. I want her to understand that love isn't something you can destroy and then expect to magically repair when it becomes convenient." "And then what?" Margaret sat across from Grace, her voice patient. "She understands. She suffers. She learns her lesson. And then what? You never speak to each other again? You both live with this pain forever?" Grace's throat felt tight. "Maybe that's what we deserve. Maybe it's what you both fear you deserve. But fear and truth aren't the same thing." Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. "Isabella asked me to give you this. She said she wrote it but didn't know if she had the right to give it to you directly." Grace stared at the envelope like it might explode. "I don't want to read her excuses." "She's not making excuses. She's making a choice." Against her better judgment, Grace opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Isabella's careful handwriting. "Mom, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. I know that saying, 'I'm sorry,' isn't enough to fix what I broke. I know that explaining why I did what I did doesn't make it okay. But I need you to know some things, even if you never want to see me again. I called Derek yesterday and told him to destroy all the recordings he made. I told him that if he releases any more information about our family, I'll file harassment charges against him. I also called Channel 7 and told them the truth, that I manipulated the story to hurt you when I was angry, and that everything I said about financial abuse was a lie. I know this doesn't undo the damage. I know your job and your reputation are still destroyed. I know that people will probably always remember the first story more than the correction. But I couldn't let you keep paying the price for my choices. I'm going to use the inheritance money Aunt Margaret has been holding to pay for therapy. Real therapy, where I figure out why I thought destroying someone I love was an acceptable way to handle my own pain. I'm also going to use some of it to hire a lawyer who specializes in reputation restoration. I don't know if it will help, but I want to try to fix what I broke. I don't expect anything from you. I don't expect forgiveness or reconciliation or another chance. I just want you to know that I finally understand the difference between being hurt and being cruel, and I'm going to spend however long it takes to make sure I never confuse the two again. You were a good mother. You sacrificed everything for me, and I used that sacrifice against you. That's not a reflection of your parenting, it's a reflection of my character. But maybe character can change. Maybe people can become worthy of the love they threw away. I love you. I know that probably doesn't mean much coming from someone who hurt you so badly, but it's true. I love you, and I'm sorry, and I'm going to try to become someone who deserves to say those words to you. Isabella." Grace read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking. When she finished, she found Margaret watching her with knowing eyes. "She's not asking you to forgive her," Margaret said quietly. "She's telling you what she's going to do regardless of whether you ever speak to her again." Grace wiped tears from her cheeks. "It doesn't change what she did." "No, it doesn't. But it might change what happens next." Grace stood and walked to her window, looking out at the street where reporters still lingered like vultures. "I don't know how to trust her again. Every time she says something, I'm going to wonder if it's true or if it's just what she thinks I want to hear. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight. It's rebuilt through consistent actions over time." Margaret joined Grace at the window. "The question is whether you want to give her the chance to rebuild it. What if she hurts me again? Then you'll survive it again. You're stronger than you think, Grace. You survived a devastating betrayal and public humiliation. You can survive whatever comes next." Grace was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the past few weeks. The shock, the anger, the overwhelming sense of loss, not just of Isabella's love, but of her own identity as a good mother. She'd always defined herself through her sacrifices for Isabella, and when those sacrifices were reframed as abuse, she'd lost her sense of who she was. But maybe that was the real problem. Maybe she'd never learned to be Grace independent of being Isabella's mother. Maybe this devastating experience was forcing her to discover who she was when she wasn't giving everything to someone else. "I need time," Grace said finally. "I need to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to protect or please or sacrifice for Isabella. I need to build a life that doesn't revolve around her choices or her needs or her approval." Margaret nodded. "That sounds healthy. But I also need to know that if I decide to try again with her, it will be because I choose to, not because I'm afraid of losing her or because I feel guilty or because she's manipulated me into it." "That also sounds healthy." Grace turned away from the window, her decision crystallizing. "I'm going to take some time. I'm going to get my own therapist and figure out how to set boundaries without cutting people off. I'm going to rebuild my life and my reputation and my sense of self. And then, maybe, if Isabella has done the work she says she's going to do, we can try to build something new." "How long do you think that will take?" Grace smiled for the first time in days. "However long it takes. I'm done rushing toward forgiveness because I'm afraid of losing love. If what Isabella and I had was real love, it will survive the time it takes to heal properly. If it wasn't, then I need to know that too." Margaret squeezed Grace's shoulder. "Isabella won't like waiting. Then she'll learn patience. She'll learn that love requires more than apologies and promises. She'll learn that some things can't be fixed quickly just because you want them to be." Grace picked up Isabella's letter and read it one more time. Her daughter's words sounded sincere, but Grace had been fooled by sincerity before. This time, she would wait for actions. This time, she would rebuild herself first and worry about rebuilding their relationship second. It felt terrifying and liberating all at once, the choice to love herself enough to demand better, even from the person she loved most in the world. For the first time in her adult life, Grace was choosing herself. It felt like the beginning of everything. Grace adjusted the microphone clip to her blazer and looked out at the audience of social workers, therapists, and family advocates filling the community center auditorium. 6 months ago, when she'd been invited to speak at the National Conference on Family Dynamics and Financial Boundaries, she'd almost said no. The idea of standing in front of strangers and talking about the most painful experience of her life had seemed impossible. But Dr. Sarah Chen, her therapist, had encouraged her to consider it. "Your story has power," she'd said. "Not just the pain, but the healing. People need to see that it's possible to rebuild after betrayal." Now, looking out at the attentive faces, Grace felt ready. 18 months ago, I thought my life was over," she began, her voice steady and clear. "My daughter had accused me of financial abuse on live television, destroyed my reputation, and nearly cost me my job and my home. I was 50 years old, alone, and convinced that everything I'd done as a mother had been a failure." She paused, finding her rhythm. "What I didn't realize then was that my life wasn't ending, it was finally beginning. For the first time in 25 years, I was forced to figure out who Grace Hartwell was when she wasn't defining herself entirely through her relationship with her daughter." The audience was completely quiet, hanging on every word. "The process of rebuilding my sense of self was the hardest thing I've ever done. It meant examining every choice I'd made, every boundary I'd failed to set, every way I'd confused love with control and sacrifice with service. It meant learning to value myself independently of whether I was being a good mother according to some impossible standard I'd created." Grace clicked to her next slide, which showed a simple chart, healthy versus unhealthy love patterns. "I learned that healthy love requires boundaries. That saying no to someone doesn't mean you love them less, sometimes it means you love them enough to let them experience the consequences of their choices. I learned that martyrdom isn't motherhood, and that raising a child to believe your happiness depends on their choices is a terrible burden to place on anyone." A hand shot up in the audience. A young woman who looked to be in her 20s. What about forgiveness? Did you ever forgive your daughter? Grace smiled. That's the most important part of the story. But forgiveness didn't happen the way I thought it would. She clicked to the next slide, a photo of herself and Isabella, taken just 3 weeks ago. They were sitting on a park bench, both smiling, but there was something different about their body language, more space between them, more independence in their postures. My daughter spent that 18 months in intensive therapy, just as she'd promised. She learned about emotional regulation, about healthy communication, about the difference between being hurt and being cruel. She also did something I never expected. She gave a public interview retracting her allegations and taking full responsibility for the manipulation she'd orchestrated. Grace's voice grew stronger. But I didn't forgive her because she did those things. I forgave her because I finally understood that forgiveness isn't about the other person's behavior, it's about freeing yourself from the prison of resentment. I forgave her for me, not for her. Another hand went up. Are you close now? Has your relationship healed? We have a relationship, Grace said carefully. But it's not the same relationship we had before, and that's actually a good thing. The old relationship was built on unhealthy patterns, my need to be needed, her learned helplessness, both of our fears of abandonment. She clicked to her final slide, building love on solid ground. Our new relationship is built on choice rather than need. We see each other because we want to, not because we feel obligated to. We respect each other's boundaries. We've learned to disagree without anyone becoming a villain. And most importantly, we both have full, independent lives that don't revolve around managing each other's emotions. The moderator stepped forward. What would you say to parents who are struggling with similar dynamics with their adult children? Grace thought for a moment. I'd say that loving someone doesn't mean enabling them. I'd say that your children's happiness is not your responsibility. Their ability to create their own happiness is one of the greatest gifts you can give them. And I'd say that it's never too late to change the patterns in your relationships, but both people have to want that change. After the presentation, Grace was surrounded by people sharing their own stories, asking for advice, expressing gratitude for her honesty. She listened to each person with the same careful attention she'd learned to give herself, present but not absorbed, caring but not responsible for their outcomes. As the crowd thinned, Grace noticed a familiar figure standing near the back of the auditorium. Isabella, wearing a simple dress and nervous smile, holding a small bouquet of flowers. Grace excused herself from her final conversation and walked over to her daughter. They'd planned to meet for dinner after the presentation, but Grace hadn't expected Isabella to attend the actual talk. "Hi, Mom," Isabella said, offering the flowers. "I hope it's okay that I came. I wanted to hear your story." Grace accepted the flowers, daisies, her favorite, not the expensive roses Isabella used to buy. "How did it feel, hearing me talk about us to strangers?" "Honest," Isabella said simply. "It felt honest. You didn't paint me as a monster, but you didn't minimize what I did either. You just told the truth." They walked together toward the exit, their steps naturally falling into sync without the careful choreography their early meetings had required. "I'm proud of you," Isabella said as they reached Grace's car. "For rebuilding your life, for finding your voice, for not letting what I did define your story." Grace smiled. "I'm proud of you too. For doing the work, for facing what you'd done, for becoming someone who can say those words and mean them." They stood in the parking lot for a moment, mother and daughter, but also two women who had fought their way back to mutual respect. "Dinner?" Isabella asked. "I found a new place that has terrible coffee and amazing pie. Very unpretentious." Grace laughed. "Sounds perfect." As they drove in separate cars to the restaurant, another symbol of their hard-won independence, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them here. 18 months ago, she'd thought losing Isabella's unconditional love was the worst thing that could happen to her. Now she understood that what they'd had wasn't love at all, it was need, fear, and habit dressed up in love's clothing. Real love, she'd learned, was what they were building now. Careful, conscious, and strong enough to survive honesty. Love that didn't require anyone to lose themselves to maintain it. Love that was chosen daily rather than assumed automatically. At the restaurant, Isabella showed Grace photos from her new job at a non-profit financial literacy organization. I'm teaching people how to manage money and spot financial manipulation, she said with a self-aware smile. Turns out I'm uniquely qualified. Grace laughed. Using your powers for good now? Something like that. My therapist says it's a form of making amends, helping other people avoid the mistakes I made. They talked about Isabella's work, Grace's speaking engagements, their separate therapy journeys, the books they were reading. Normal conversation between two adults who cared about each other but didn't need each other to be complete. When they parted ways in the parking lot, they hugged, a real hug, warm but brief, affectionate but not desperate. I love you, Mom, Isabella said. I love you too, sweetheart, Grace replied. I'll see you next month for your birthday. Looking forward to it. Grace drove home to her new apartment, bigger than the old one, in a better neighborhood, paid for with the settlement from her wrongful termination lawsuit and the income from her growing speaking career. The walls were decorated with new photos alongside the old ones, pictures of Grace with friends, at conferences, on the solo vacation she'd taken to Ireland last spring. She was no longer just Isabella's mother. She was Grace, a woman with her own interests, her own dreams, her own carefully protected heart that she'd learned to value as much as anyone else's. Her phone buzzed with a text from Janet. Saw the video of your presentation online. You're changing lives. So proud of you. Grace smiled and typed back, thank you. Coffee this weekend? Another text, this one from Margaret. Isabella called. Said the presentation was beautiful. You're both becoming the women you were meant to be. Grace set her phone aside and made herself tea in her favorite mug, not the one she saved for special occasions, but the one that felt perfect in her hands every ordinary day. She settled onto her couch with a book she was reading purely for pleasure, surrounded by the quiet peace of a life she'd built for herself. Outside her window, the city hummed with the sounds of other people living their own complicated, beautiful lives. Grace was part of that tapestry now, not standing on the sidelines watching others live while she sacrificed, but fully present in her own story. The woman who had once measured her worth by how much she could give had learned to measure it by how consciously she could choose. The mother who had once loved with desperation had learned to love with wisdom. And the daughter who had once tried to destroy love to control it had learned that real love was worth waiting for, worth growing into, worth choosing every day, worth the patient work of becoming someone worthy of giving and receiving it. It had taken 18 months, 2 therapists, countless difficult conversations, and the courage to rebuild everything from the ground up. But they had found their way to something neither of them had known was possible, a love that made both of them more themselves rather than less. Grace turned the page of her book and settled deeper into her own life, grateful for the long journey that had brought her home to herself. Outside, the world continued its ancient dance of breaking and healing, and Grace was no longer afraid of either. She had learned the most important lesson of all, that love worth having was love that made you brave enough to be yourself, generous enough to let others do the same, and wise enough to know the difference. What did you think of Grace and Isabella's journey to healing? Do you believe people can truly change their patterns in relationships? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear about your own experiences with forgiveness and family dynamics.